My neighbor changed everything and never stopped until dawn. It was one of those summer afternoons where the sun blazed so fiercely that the pavement felt like it could melt underfoot. Ethan, 27 years old and drenched in sweat, was jogging back to his small-town apartment. He hated running in this heat, but for him, it wasn't just about fitness. It was about clearing his mind, shaking off the thoughts that clung to him like the humidity in the air. As he approached his building, fumbling for his keys, he spotted Lily. She was sitting on her porch, sipping iced tea, the glass sweating almost as much as he was. Lily wasn't like anyone else in the complex. She was confident and vibrant, and carried herself in a way that made you want to know her story. Ethan had noticed her before, but they'd only ever exchanged polite nods or brief hellos in passing. This time was different. As soon as she saw him, a smirk spread across her face. "You look like you've been through a war," she teased, her voice light but playful. Ethan laughed, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Feels like it," he said, glancing at her. The way the evening sun caught her hair made him pause. There was something magnetic about her, something he couldn't quite place. "Why don't you take a break?" she offered, nodding toward the empty chair beside her. "Unless you're planning to keep sweating through the rest of the night." Ethan hesitated. He wasn't used to this spontaneous invitations or casual conversation, but something about Lily's tone made him feel at ease. "Sure," he said, sliding into the chair and letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of cicadas filling the air. Lily took a slow sip of her tea before breaking the quiet. "So Ethan, what's your deal? You're always so polite, so quiet. Do you ever just let loose?" Her question caught him off guard. He wasn't sure how to answer. "I guess I just try to keep things steady," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I don't like to cause waves." Lily raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Steady's fine," she said, leaning back in her chair. "But it's also boring." "You don't strike me as boring, Ethan." Her words lingered in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something shift. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had been too steady, too careful. But before he could respond, Lily stood up, her dress catching the breeze. "Come on," she said, her tone almost challenging. "I've got better drinks inside." Without waiting for his answer, she walked toward her door, leaving Ethan with no choice but to follow. Inside, her apartment was cooler, the air conditioning a welcome relief from the suffocating heat outside. The room was cozy but stylish, with books stacked on every available surface and soft lighting that made everything feel warm and inviting. Ethan stood awkwardly near the entrance, unsure of where to go. "Relax," Lily said, motioning toward the couch. "You're acting like I'm about to interrogate you or something." Ethan laughed nervously and sat down. Lily handed him a glass of something cold and citrusy before sitting beside him. The closeness between them felt electric, the unspoken tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "So," she said, turning to face him, "tell me something interesting about yourself, something no one else knows." Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of her question. "I don't know," he said, trying to think. "I'm not that interesting." Lily rolled her eyes. "Come on, Ethan, everyone has something. Don't make me work for it." Her playful tone made him smile, and he finally relented. "All right," he said. "When I was a kid, I wanted to be a pilot. I used to sit on the roof and watch planes fly by, imagining where they were going." Lily's face lit up. "Now that's interesting," she said. "So what happened? Why aren't you flying the skies right now?" Ethan shrugged, his expression growing more serious. "Life, I guess. Things didn't work out the way I planned." Her smile softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Life has a way of doing that," she said quietly. "But it's not over yet." Ethan looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. There was something comforting about her words, something that made him feel like he wasn't as lost as he thought he was. As the conversation continued, Ethan found himself relaxing, letting down walls he hadn't even realized he'd built. Lily had a way of drawing him out, of making him feel like he could be himself without fear of judgment. And as the evening stretched on, he realized that this wasn't just a casual chat with a neighbor. It was something more, something he wasn't ready to let go of. Ethan's perspective: life of monotony. Ethan's days always felt the same. He would wake up to the sound of his alarm clock, its beeping cutting through the stillness of his small apartment. The sunlight streaming through his window was supposed to feel warm and inviting, but to Ethan, it only highlighted the sameness of his life. Every morning he would stretch, brew a cup of coffee, and stare out at the world beyond his kitchen window, wondering if today would be any different. But it never was. He worked a steady job at a local office, the kind of place where people clocked in, did just enough to get by, and counted the hours until they could leave. Ethan's coworkers often joked about the monotony, but for him it wasn't funny. He wanted more, he just didn't know how to get it. Most nights, Ethan would lace up his running shoes and hit the pavement, not because he loved running but because it gave him something to do. It was his way of escaping, even if only for a little while. With every step, he could feel the weight of his frustrations lifting, but they always came back the moment he stopped. His mind was a constant swirl of what ifs. What if he had made different choices? What if he had pursued his dreams instead of playing it safe? What if he could just take a chance, even once, without fearing the consequence? These questions haunted him, but they also kept him stuck, like a bird too afraid to leave its cage. As he jogged through the neighborhood, his thoughts would wander. Sometimes he thought about his neighbors, the lives they lived, the things they had that he didn't. He wasn't envious, exactly, but he couldn't help but wonder if they had it all figured out. People like Lily, for example. She seemed so self-assured, so comfortable in her own skin. Ethan couldn't imagine feeling that way. He had seen her around before, always with a confident stride or a playful smile. She was the kind of person who drew attention without even trying, and Ethan had always admired that. Not that he would ever say it out loud. He wasn't the type to strike up conversations or make bold moves. He preferred to stay in the background, unnoticed and unbothered, but that didn't mean he didn't notice her. There were moments when Ethan caught himself wondering what her life was like. Did she ever feel the way he did, lost, unsure, stuck? Or was she one of those people who always seemed to land on their feet, no matter what? He doubted she ever gave him much thought. But that didn't stop him from thinking about her. On particularly restless nights, Ethan would sit on his small balcony, looking out at the stars and thinking about all the things he wanted to say but never did. He wanted to tell Lily that she inspired him in ways he didn't fully understand. He wanted to tell her that her laughter, even from a distance, had a way of breaking through his gloom. But he never would, because that wasn't who he was. Ethan's life wasn't bad, not in the ways that mattered. He had a roof over his head, a steady income, and people who cared about him, even if he didn't see them often. But there was something missing, something he couldn't quite put into words. It was like a dull ache, always there but hard to pinpoint. He wanted more, but he didn't know what more looked like. Every time he tried to figure it out, the fear crept in. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of being seen as weak or foolish. It was easier to stay in his lane, to keep moving forward without making waves. At least that way, he couldn't mess up. But deep down, he knew that wasn't enough. Not anymore. As he turned the corner on his usual running route, Ethan slowed to a stop, catching his breath. The street was quiet, the kind of stillness that only came after sunset in a small town. He looked up at the sky, the stars barely visible through the hazy glow of the streetlight, and felt a pang of longing. He didn't know what he was longing for, exactly, just that it was something more than that. That's when he saw her. Lily was sitting on her porch, her silhouette illuminated by the warm glow of her porch light. She had a glass of iced tea in her hand, the condensation dripping onto her fingers. Her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders, and she looked so effortlessly at ease that it took Ethan's breath away. For a moment he considered walking the other way, avoiding the possibility of awkward conversation. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she looked up and caught his eye, her lips curling into a smile that felt like an invitation. Or maybe it was the part of him that was tired of running, not just physically, but emotionally. Before he knew it, he was walking toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't care. All he knew was that this moment felt different, like the start of something he couldn't quite explain. And as he approached her porch, the world around him seemed to fade away. It was just him and Lily, the summer night, and the possibility of something new. Lily's perspective beneath the confidence. From the outside, Lily seemed like someone who had it all together. She was the neighbor everyone liked, the woman with the confident stride and easy laugh. But what most people didn't know was how much effort it took to keep up that image. Beneath the surface, Lily often felt like she was barely holding it together. Her days started early, long before the sun had a chance to cast its golden light through her curtains. She liked the quiet of the morning, the way the world felt still and unhurried. It gave her a chance to think, to center herself before the noise of the day crept in. Most mornings she would sip her coffee on the porch, watching the neighborhood wake up. It was her ritual, a small slice of peace in an otherwise chaotic mind. Lily's move to this small town had been an act of desperation, though she never told anyone that. After her divorce she had felt unmoored, like a ship without an anchor. The city had become too loud, too fast, too full of memories she was trying to forget. This town, with its slower pace and friendly faces, seemed like the perfect place to start over. But starting over wasn't as easy as she had hoped. The first few months were the hardest. She spent countless nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made a mistake. She missed the familiarity of her old life. Even if it had been far from perfect, the quiet she had once craved now felt suffocating, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. Lily tried to fill her days with small projects, gardening, painting, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind distracted. But no matter how much she did, there was always a lingering ache, a sense that something was missing. She had friends in town, sure, but they didn't really know her. Not the real her. The one who carried a suitcase of regrets and unanswered questions. She thought about her ex-husband more often than she cared to admit. Not because she missed him, but because their marriage had left her with so many doubts about herself. Was she too difficult to love? Too independent? Too much of everything? Those questions lingered, shaping how she approached the world and the people in it. It was easier to pretend, to play the part of the carefree neighbor who always had a smile ready. It kept people at arm's length, far enough away that they couldn't see the cracks in her armor. But sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet, Lily wished someone could see her for who she really was. That's why Ethan intrigued her. From the moment she first saw him, jogging through the neighborhood, with a determined yet distracted look on his face, she could tell he wasn't like most people. There was a seriousness about him, a quiet intensity that made her curious. He wasn't flashy or overly confident, but there was something about him that drew her in. She had noticed the way he avoided eye contact during their brief exchanges, the way he seemed almost afraid to be noticed. It was endearing in a way. But it also made her wonder what he was hiding. What walls was he keeping up, and why? Lily hadn't planned on inviting him to sit with her that night. It had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, driven by a mix of curiosity and her own need for connection. She had seen the exhaustion on his face, the way he carried himself like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she wanted to know more about him. As they talked, Lily found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. There was something about Ethan that felt safe, like she could let her guard down without fear of judgment. She told him about her divorce, her decision to leave the city, and the struggles she faced starting over. It wasn't easy to share those parts of herself, but with Ethan it felt right. What surprised her most was how much she enjoyed listening to him. Ethan had a way of speaking that was honest and thoughtful. Even when he was talking about his fears and frustration, he wasn't trying to impress her or put on a show. He was just being himself, and that was enough. For the first time in a long time, Lily felt like she wasn't alone. She wasn't just the confident neighbor or the woman with the quick laugh. She was a person with flaws and fears, sitting across from someone who understood what that felt like. As the night wore on, Lily found herself looking at Ethan differently. He wasn't just the quiet guy next door anymore. He was someone who saw her, really saw her, in a way that no one else had in years. And as they laughed and talked under the soft glow of her porch light, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The porch seen sparks fly. The porch was bathed in the soft glow of the string lights Lily had hung earlier in the summer. They weren't fancy, just small white bulbs strung between the posts, but they cast a warm, inviting light that made the space feel almost magical. Ethan sat in the chair Lily had offered him, his hands wrapped around the cold glass of lemonade she'd handed him earlier. It was sweet, tangy, and refreshing, a perfect contrast to the warm night air. Lily sat across from him, her legs curled up beneath her, looking completely at ease. For a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. The hum of cicadas filled the air, blending with the occasional rustle of leaves in the light breeze. It was the kind of night that felt timeless, as if the world had paused just for them. "You don't talk much, do you?" Lily said suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. Her tone was teasing, but there was genuine curiosity in her eyes. Ethan smiled sheepishly, swirling the lemonade in his glass. "I guess I'm just not used to this." Lily tilted her head, her eyebrows raising slightly. He gestured vaguely at the porch, at her. "Talking like this with someone." Lily leaned forward, resting her chin in her hand. "What's so scary about talking?" Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know. It's not scary, exactly. I guess I just don't do it often. It feels different." "Different isn't always a bad thing," Lily said, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were trying to read him. "You're interesting, Ethan. I like talking to you." The comment caught him off guard, and he felt a warmth creeping up his neck. He wasn't used to compliment, especially not from someone like Lily, someone who seemed so sure of herself, so comfortable in her own skin. "You're interesting too," he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "More than interesting." Lily smiled, her lips curling in a way that made Ethan's heart race. "Careful, Ethan. If you keep saying things like that, I might start to believe you." The teasing lilt in her voice made him laugh, and the sound surprised him. It wasn't often that he laughed like this, freely, without overthinking. It felt good, like something inside him was loosening. As the conversation continued, the tension between them began to shift. It wasn't the awkward, uncertain tension of two strangers getting to know each other. It was something else, something electric and unspoken. Lily would lean forward when she laughed, her hand brushing his arm, and every time she did, Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "Okay," Lily said, setting her glass down on the table beside her. "I have a question for you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "All right, shoot. If you could do anything, absolutely anything, no limits, what would it be?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp, watching him closely. Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. He thought about the dreams he used to have, the ones he'd buried under the weight of practicality and fear. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe travel. See places I've only ever read about." "Like where?" Lily pressed, her curiosity genuine. "Everywhere," Ethan said, his voice gaining confidence. "The mountains, the ocean, cities that never sleep. I want to see it all." Lily's smile widened, and she leaned back in her chair, her eyes sparkling. "That's a good answer. But why haven't you done it yet?" He looked at her, caught off guard by the directness of her question. "I guess I've always been too scared. It's easier to stay where it's safe, where you know what to expect." Lily nodded, her expression softening. "Yeah, safe is comfortable, but comfortable doesn't always make you happy." Her words lingered in the air, and Ethan felt something shift inside him. She was right. He'd been living in his comfort zone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to take risks, to chase after something bigger than himself. "What about you?" he asked, turning the question back on her. "What would you do if there were no limits?" Lily hesitated, a small smile playing on her lips. "I'd open an art studio," she said after a moment. "A little place where people could come and create, where they wouldn't feel judged or rushed, just a space to be themselves." Ethan smiled, the image of Lily in an art studio fitting her perfectly. "That sounds amazing, you should do it." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Maybe someday, when I'm braver." "You're already brave," Ethan said before he could stop himself. The words hung between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Lily looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if she were trying to understand him better. "You're full of surprises, Ethan," she said finally, her voice softer now. He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe I just needed someone to bring them out." The moment stretched, the air between them charged with something neither of them could name. Ethan felt his heart pounding in his chest, and for the first time in a long time he didn't feel the need to run from. Lily leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're not as quiet as you think, Ethan. You just needed someone to listen." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deep in his chest. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized he didn't want this moment to end, breaking the ice indoors. When Lily invited Ethan inside, he hesitated for a moment, standing awkwardly at the threshold. It wasn't that he didn't want to go, he did. It was just that this was unfamiliar territory for him. But Lily, with her easy smile and relaxed confidence, had a way of making the unfamiliar feel a little less daunting. "Come on," she said, holding the door open. "I promise it's cooler in here. Besides, you can't leave without trying my famous cookies." "Famous?" Ethan said, stepping inside. "That's a big claim. Trust me, they're life-changing," Lily teased, leading him into the living room. "Well, maybe not life-changing, but they're pretty good." Ethan chuckled, glancing around the room as he followed her. It was cozy and inviting, filled with little touches that seemed distinctly Lily. There were books stacked in uneven piles on the coffee table, a framed photo of a younger Lily with what looked like her parents on the wall, and a soft throw blanket draped over the back of the couch. "Make yourself at home," Lily said, disappearing into the kitchen. "I'll be right back." Ethan sat down on the couch, feeling slightly out of place but also oddly comfortable. The room smelled faintly of lavender, and the faint hum of the refrigerator added to the quiet warmth of the space. He picked up a book from the table, flipping it open to a random page. It was a novel, well-worn with dog-eared pages and little notes scribbled in the margins. "You're a reader," he called out as Lily returned with a plate of cookies and 2 glasses of milk. "Guilty," she said, setting the plate down and handing him a glass. "I go through phases. Sometimes I'll read 3 books in a week, and then I won't pick one up for months. What about you?" Ethan shrugged, taking a bite of a cookie. "I used to read a lot, but not so much anymore. Life kind of got in the way." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It has a way of doing that, doesn't it? Getting in the way." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty. Ethan took another bite of the cookie, surprised by how good it was. "Okay, I'll admit it," he said. "These are pretty amazing." Lily grinned, leaning back in her chair. "Told you, they're my secret weapon. Perfect for winning over grumpy neighbors." "I'm not grumpy," Ethan protested, though the smile tugging at his lips gave him away. "Not now," Lily said with a laugh. "But you were the first time I saw you. You looked so serious, like the world was resting on your shoulders." Ethan's smile faded slightly, and he stared down at the glass in his hands. "Sometimes it feels like that," he admitted quietly. "Like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Lily's expression softened, and she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "That's a lot to carry, Ethan. Have you ever thought about setting it down for a while?" He glanced up at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "How do you do that?" "Set it down, I mean." "You don't," Lily said simply. "Not all at once. Anyway, you do it piece by piece, one little thing at a time." Her words hung in the air, and Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He nodded, his grip on the glass loosening. "Yeah, maybe you're right." "Of course I'm right," Lily said, her tone light but her smile warm. "I'm always right. It's one of my best qualities." Ethan laughed, the sound filling the room and easing the weight in his chest. "I'll keep that in mind." They talked for hours after that, their conversation weaving between light-hearted stories and deeper confession. Lily told him about her love for painting and how she'd always dreamed of opening an art studio. Ethan shared his childhood dream of becoming a pilot and the bittersweet memory of watching planes fly overhead with his dad. "Why didn't you?" Lily asked, her voice soft. "Become a pilot, I mean." Ethan hesitated, staring down at his empty glass. "Life got in the way," he said finally. "Or maybe I just didn't believe in myself enough to try." Lily nodded, her gaze steady. "It's not too late, you know." Ethan smiled faintly, the thought both comforting and daunting. Maybe. As the night stretched on, the space between them seemed to shrink. They sat closer now, their laughter softer but no less frequent. Every now and then, Lily's hand would brush against his, and each time it sent a small jolt through him. He wondered if she felt it too. "You know," Lily said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I don't usually do this." "Do what?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "Invite people in," she said, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I'm not good at letting people get close." Ethan looked at her, his chest tightening. "Me neither." Lily smiled faintly, glancing up at him. "Guess we're both breaking our own rules tonight." "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess we are." The moment stretched between them, the air thick with something unspoken. Ethan's heart raced, and for a split second he thought about leaning in, about closing the small distance between them. But before he could move, Lily stood, breaking the spell. "It's late," she said, her tone light but her eyes lingering on his. "You should probably get going." Ethan nodded, standing as well. "Yeah, you're right." As he moved toward the door, Lily followed, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. Just as he reached for the handle, she spoke again. "Ethan." He turned, his heart pounding. "Yeah, thanks for tonight," she said, her smile small but genuine. "I think I needed it." "Me too," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Good night, Lily." "Good night, Ethan," she replied, her eyes holding his for just a moment longer before he stepped outside. As the door closed behind him, Ethan stood on the porch, the night air cool against his skin. He felt lighter somehow, as if something had shifted inside him, and as he walked back to his apartment he couldn't help but smile. Rising tension confessions begin. The next evening, Ethan found himself standing on his balcony, staring at Lily's porch. The string lights were glowing softly, but the chair she usually occupied was empty. He tried not to feel disappointed after all. She didn't owe him her time. But after last night he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. He was about to head back inside when he heard her voice. Thinking about jumping, or just enjoying the view, she called out, her tone playful as she stepped onto her porch, a cup of tea in her hand. Ethan smiled, leaning on the railing. Neither. Just waiting for inspiration to strike. Well, Lily said, raising her cup, here's to inspiration. It didn't take long before they were sitting on her porch again, the night air warm and the conversation flowing easily. This time it felt even more natural, as if they had skipped over the small talk and dived straight into the kind of connection that usually took months to build. So Lily said, her tone teasing but curious, what's the biggest secret you've ever kept? Ethan raised an eyebrow. That's a bold question. I'm a bold person, she replied with a grin. Come on, Ethan, you know mine. It's only fair. He hesitated, taking a sip of the lemonade she'd handed him. I don't know if I have any big secrets. Everyone has secrets, Lily said, leaning closer. Even you, Mr. Polite Guy. Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head. All right. When I was in college I almost dropped out. Twice. Lily's eyebrows shot up. Really? Why? He shrugged, his gaze dropping to his hands. I didn't think I was good enough. Everyone else seemed to know exactly what they were doing and I felt like I was just faking it. Lily nodded, her expression softening. I get that. I felt that way too. More times than I can count. Yeah, Ethan asked, glancing at her. Oh, definitely, Lily said, her voice quieter now. When I was married, I used to feel like I had to be perfect all the time. Like if I messed up even once, everything would fall apart. And then it did anyway. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Ethan wanted to say something, but he didn't know what. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing hers. It was a small gesture, but it said everything he couldn't. Thanks, she said softly, her eyes meeting his. I don't talk about that much. I mean, neither, Ethan admitted. About the college thing, I guess it just felt embarrassing. It's not, Lily said firmly. It's real. And sometimes real is messy. But that doesn't make it bad. Her words settled deep in Ethan's chest, and he felt something inside him loosen. He hadn't realized how much he'd been holding back until now. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the night filling the spaces between them. Eventually, Lily spoke again. Do you ever think about what your life would be like if you'd done things differently, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. All the time, Ethan said without hesitation. But I think, maybe I wouldn't have ended up here. Lily smiled faintly, her gaze distant. Here isn't so bad. No, Ethan agreed. It's not. As the conversation deepened, so did the tension between them. It wasn't the kind of tension that came from awkwardness or uncertainty. It was the kind that came from two people realizing they were standing on the edge of something they couldn't quite name. Ethan found himself leaning closer, his heart pounding. Lily's hand was still resting near his, and he wondered if she could feel the same pull he did. But just as he was about to say something, Lily spoke. You know what scares me the most, she said, her voice trembling slightly. What? Ethan asked, his throat dry. Letting someone in, she admitted, her eyes locked on his, and then losing them. Ethan's chest tightened, and he nodded slowly. Yeah, me too. Lily looked down, her hair falling across her face. It's stupid, right? I mean, I barely know you. It's not stupid, Ethan said quickly. And I feel it too. Her gaze snapped up to his, her eyes searching his face for something, reassurance, maybe, or understanding. Whatever it was, Ethan hoped she found it. Because, in that moment he meant every word. The space between them seemed to shrink, and Ethan's breath hitched. He could see the slight tremble in Lily's hand, the way her lips parted as if she were about to speak but couldn't find the words. And then, slowly she leaned in. The first brush of her lips against his was tentative, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through him that made his entire body hum with electricity. He kissed her back, his movements just as carefully as if he were afraid of breaking the moment. When they finally pulled away, their foreheads resting against each other, Lily let out a shaky laugh. Well, she said, her voice unsteady but light, I didn't see that coming. Me neither, Ethan admitted, his heart racing. But I'm glad it did. For the rest of the night they stayed on the porch, their conversation quieter now but no less meaningful. The connection between them had shifted and deepened, and as the hours slipped by, neither of them wanted to let it go. Midpoint crisis, internal struggles. Ethan woke up the next morning with a strange mix of emotions swirling in his chest. The memory of Lily's kiss lingered in his mind, as vivid as if it had just happened. He could still feel the warmth of her lips, the way her hand had trembled slightly in his. But alongside the thrill of it all, there was something else, an ache of uncertainty that he couldn't shake. He sat at his kitchen table, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared out the window. What had he gotten himself into? He wasn't the kind of guy who just fell into things like this. He overthought everything and planned every step. But with Lily it was like all his usual rules had gone out the window, and that terrified him. What if this wasn't real? What if he was reading too much into it, projecting feelings onto her that she didn't really share? He thought about her words from the night before about letting people in and the fear of losing them. He understood that fear all too well, but what if, by taking this chance, he ended up proving himself right? What if he did lose her? The thought was enough to make his chest tighten, and he set the mug down with a soft thud. He had always been good at playing it safe, at avoiding risks that might lead to failure. But this didn't feel like something he could avoid anymore, and maybe that was the scariest part of all. Across town, Lily sat on her porch, her sketchbook open on her lap. The pencil in her hand moved across the page in slow, deliberate strokes, but her heart wasn't in it. She had been trying to capture the scene from the night before, the soft glow of the string lights, the way Ethan had looked at her like she was the only person in the world. But no matter how hard she tried, the image refused to come together. She set the pencil down with a frustrated sigh, leaning back in her chair. What was she doing? Inviting Ethan into her world like that? Letting him see parts of her she usually kept hidden? It wasn't like her. She had always been careful about who she let get close, and for good reason. Every time she had opened herself up before, it had ended in heartbreak. Her marriage had taught her that much. She could still hear her ex-husband's voice in her head, the way he had accused her of being too independent, too focused on her own goals. He had wanted her to be someone she wasn't, and when she couldn't be that person, he had left. The wounds from that time still felt fresh, even though years had passed. And now here she was, risking it all again with someone she barely knew. "What's wrong with me?" she muttered, closing the sketchbook and setting it aside. But even as she tried to push the thoughts away, her mind drifted back to Ethan. The way he had looked at her, the way he had listened, without judgment, the way he had kissed her so gently, it made her heart ache. He was different from anyone she had ever known, and that scared her more than she wanted to admit. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over his name in her contact. Part of her wanted to call him, to hear his voice and reassure herself that this wasn't just a dream. But another part of her, the part that had been hurt before, held her back. What if he changed his mind? What if he decided this wasn't worth it? What if she let him in, only to lose him like she had lost so many others? Lily set the phone down, her chest tightening with the weight of it all. She had spent so much time building walls around herself, convincing herself that she didn't need anyone. But now, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't so sure. Ethan spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Lily. He replayed their conversations in his mind, the way she had smiled at him, the way her voice had softened when she shared her fears. She had let him see parts of her that felt so private, so vulnerable, and it made him want to protect her in a way he hadn't felt before. But it also made him question everything. What if he wasn't enough for her? What if he messed this up like he had messed up so many other things in his life? He thought about the times he had tried and failed, the times he had let his fear hold him back. Was he really ready to take this kind of risk? As the day turned into evening, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't keep letting his fear control him. If he wanted this, if he wanted her, he was going to have to take a chance, even if it scared him. He grabbed his phone and typed out a message, his fingers trembling slightly as he hit send. "Hey, are you free tonight? I'd love to see you." When Lily's phone buzzed, she hesitated before picking it up. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Ethan's name on the screen. She opened the message, her lips curving into a small smile as she read it. For a moment she debated what to say. Part of her wanted to say no, to protect herself from the possibility of getting hurt. But another part, the part that remembered the way he had held her hand, the way he had kissed her, wanted to say yes. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she finally typed out a reply. "Yeah, I'm free. Come over." When the message was sent, she set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, her heart racing. She didn't know what tonight would bring, but for the first time in a long time she was willing to find out. Climactic connection, vulnerability fully revealed. The air inside Lily's living room was heavy with unspoken words. Ethan sat on the couch, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze flickering between the floor and Lily, who was sitting just a few feet away. She looked calm on the surface, but he could see the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, betraying the nerves beneath. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft but steady, "can I ask you something?" He looked up, nodding. "Of course." "Why did you come here tonight?" she asked, her eyes locking onto his. The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he wasn't sure how to answer. Why had he come? Because he wanted to see her. Because he couldn't stop thinking about her. Because for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally waking up from a long, restless sleep. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just felt like I needed to." Lily nodded, her gaze never wavering. "I'm glad you did." Her words hung in the air, and Ethan felt his chest tighten. He wanted to say something more, to tell her how much she meant to him already, but the words felt stuck in his throat. Instead, he leaned back, letting out a shaky breath. "I'm not good at this," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "Talking about how I feel, I mean." "Neither am I," Lily said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But maybe that's why we're here, to figure it out." Ethan looked at her, his heart pounding. "Do you ever feel like you're not enough?" he asked, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "All the time," Lily replied without hesitation, "especially after my marriage ended. I spent so much time trying to be perfect, to be what he wanted, and when it all fell apart, I felt like I'd failed, like I wasn't good enough to keep it together." Ethan's chest ached at her confession, and he reached out, his hand brushing hers. "It wasn't your fault," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Sometimes things just fall apart. It doesn't mean you failed." Lily looked down at their hands, her fingers curling slightly around his. "I know that now," she said quietly, "but it took me a long time to get here." For a moment the room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Ethan wanted to say something to reassure her, but he didn't know how. Instead, he tightened his grip on her hand, hoping it would be enough. "What about you?" Lily asked, her voice breaking the quiet. "Why do you feel like you're not enough?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I've always felt like that," he admitted. "Even as a kid, I was always afraid of messing up, of letting people down. So I stopped trying. It was easier to stay in my comfort zone than to risk failing." "But you're here now," Lily pointed out, her eyes searching his face. "That's not your comfort zone." He laughed softly, the sound bitter. "No, it's not. But it scares me, Lily. Being here with you, feeling this way, it scares me more than I want to admit." "Me too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe that's not a bad thing." Ethan looked at her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe being scared is a sign that it matters," she said, her gaze steady. "That it's worth it." Her words settled deep in his chest, and for the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He nodded slowly, his grip on her hand tightening. "Maybe you're right." Lily smiled, her eyes softening. "I think I am." They sat there for a while, their hands entwined, the silence between them no longer heavy but comforting. Ethan felt like he could finally breathe, like the walls he had built around himself were starting to crack. And as he looked at Lily, he realized he didn't want to rebuild them. "Not this time." "Lily," he said, his voice breaking the quiet, "I don't know where this is going, but I want to find out. With you." Her smile widened, and she nodded. "Me too, Ethan." It wasn't a grand declaration or a sweeping gesture. It was quiet and simple, but it was enough. For the first time, they were both stepping into the unknown. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. Resolution, new beginnings. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The sunlight streaming through his window seemed brighter, and the air felt lighter. He lay in bed for a moment, replaying the events of the night before. The way Lily had looked at him, the softness in her voice, the warmth of her hand in his, it all felt so vivid, so real. For the first time, he wasn't overwhelmed by doubts or second-guessing. Instead, he felt calm. Hopeful, like maybe, just maybe, he was finally on the right path. He got up and made himself a cup of coffee, sipping it as he stood on his balcony. From here he could see Lily's porch. The string lights were off now, but the sight of her empty chair brought a smile to his face. He wondered if she was awake yet, if she was thinking about last night the way he was. Before he could overthink it, he grabbed his phone and typed out a message. "Morning. Thanks again for last night. I can't stop thinking about it." He hit send before he could change his mind, his heart pounding as he waited for a reply. A few minutes later his phone buzzed. Me neither. Lily's message read. "Want to come over for coffee?" Ethan didn't need to be asked twice. He threw on a jacket and headed out the door, his nerves buzzing with excitement. As he walked to her place, he found himself smiling, something he hadn't done so freely in a long time. Lily opened the door before he could knock, a steaming mug in her hand and a small smile on her lips. "Good morning," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Morning," Ethan replied, his smile widening. "You beat me to it. I thought I'd make myself useful," she said, handing him the mug. "Black, right? Perfect," he said, taking a sip. "Thanks." They moved to the living room, settling into the same spots they'd occupied the night before. But this time the atmosphere was lighter and more relaxed. There were no walls between them now, no hesitations or unspoken fears. They had laid those to rest, and what remained was something simple but profound, a connection they both wanted to nurture. "So," Lily began, her tone playful, "how does it feel to be up this early?" Ethan laughed, the sound easy and genuine. "Not bad, especially if it means coffee with you." Lily rolled her eyes, but her smile didn't falter. "Flattery will get you everywhere." They talked for hours, their conversation weaving between serious topics and lighthearted banter. Lily told him about her plans to start painting again, to finally finish the pieces she'd been too afraid to complete. Ethan shared his dream of traveling, of seeing the world beyond the small bubble he had built for himself. "What's stopping you?" Lily asked, her gaze curious but encouraging. "Nothing, I guess," Ethan said, his brow furrowing. "Just me. I've been stuck for so long, I don't even know where to start." Lily reached out, her hand brushing his. "Then start small," she said. "One step at a time. You don't have to figure it all out today." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deep in Ethan's chest. He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, you're right. I usually am," Lily teased, her eyes sparkling. Ethan laughed, the sound filling the room. "I'll keep that in mind." As the day went on, they fell into an easy rhythm, their laughter and shared stories filling the space that had once felt so heavy with uncertainty. And as Ethan looked at Lily, he realized he didn't feel scared anymore. He felt something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. He felt free. That afternoon, as Ethan walked back to his apartment, he couldn't help but think about everything that had brought him to this moment. The doubts, the fears, the walls he had built around himself, they had all seemed so insurmountable before. But now they felt like distant memories, like shadows that had finally begun to fade. And it wasn't just because of Lily, though she had been a big part of it. It was because he had chosen to take a chance, to step out of his comfort zone and into something unknown. and in doing so he had found not only her but a part of himself he thought he had lost. As he reached his door, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out and smiled at the message on the screen. "Thanks for today. Let's do it again soon." He typed out a reply, his fingers steady and sure. "Absolutely. Make a closing reflections and growth." Ethan stood on the hill overlooking the town, the morning sun casting a golden glow over the rooftops and winding streets. It was a view he'd seen 100 times before, but today it felt different. Today it felt like a promise. He took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. His mind wandered back to the past few weeks, to Lily, to their late-night conversations, to the moments when they had let down their walls and allowed each other in. It hadn't been easy. In fact, it had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done, but it had also been worth it. "Life's messy," Lily had said once, her voice tinged with both wisdom and humor. "But that doesn't mean it's not beautiful." She was right. Life was messy. It was unpredictable and complicated and full of moments that didn't make sense. But it was also beautiful in ways Ethan hadn't appreciated until now. He thought about all the times he had let fear hold him back, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough. For so long he had let those fears dictate his choices, keeping him in a box that felt safe but stifling. But now, for the first time, he was stepping out of that box. He was taking risks, letting himself be vulnerable, and finding a strength he didn't know he had. Lily had shown him that. At the same time, Lily stood in her living room, a blank canvas propped up in front of her. The sunlight streaming through the windows cast a warm glow on her face as she stared at the empty surface, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and nerves. She hadn't painted in years, not since her marriage had ended, not since she had convinced herself that her dreams weren't worth pursuing. But today she was ready. Today she wasn't going to let fear stop her. Picking up a brush, she dipped it into a pool of vibrant blue paint. The first stroke felt tentative, almost hesitant, but as the color spread across the canvas, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years: joy. Pure, unfiltered joy. She thought about Ethan, about the way he had encouraged her without even realizing. He had a way of seeing the world that made her want to see it too, not through the lens of fear or doubt, but through a lens of possibility. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself, her voice steady, and she believed it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and Lily found themselves back on the porch, where it had all begun. The string lights above them glowed softly, casting a warm, inviting light. They sat side by side, their shoulders brushing, their hands resting close but not quite touching. "You know," Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence, "if you'd told me a month ago that I'd be here, I wouldn't have believed you." Lily smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Me neither." They fell silent again, the sound of crickets and the rustling leaves filling the space between them. It wasn't an awkward silence, it was full of meaning, of unspoken gratitude for the journey they had both taken to get here. "I think," Ethan began, his voice thoughtful, "I'm finally starting to understand what you meant about life is messy, but beautiful." Lily turned to him, her eyes soft. "It took you long enough, Kenma." They both laughed, the sound carrying into the evening air. It was a laugh that held more than humor, it held relief, joy, and a shared understanding that they were exactly where they were meant to be. As the night deepened, Ethan reached out, his hand brushing against Lily's. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, letting their fingers intertwine. "What now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Ethan looked at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "Now, we keep going, one step at a time." Lily nodded, her smile matching. "One step at a time." And at that moment, under the soft glow of the string lights, they both knew they weren't just starting something new, they were creating something worth holding on to.